I still remember the day it all started, the day my world shifted in a way I wasn't ready for. I was 19, and for the first time in years, my mom seemed genuinely happy. After being alone for so long, she had finally met someone, Nate. He was calm, confident, and so effortlessly charming that you couldn't help but like him. He wasn't much older than her, maybe 5 years or so, but still, something about him felt different. When they got married, life felt stable for the first time in forever. He was everything my mom needed, supportive, reliable, always saying the right things at just the right moment. At first, I was happy for her. He treated her well, and that's all I ever wanted. But as time went on, something changed. Or maybe I just started noticing things I hadn't before. It wasn't anything obvious, no inappropriate words, no strange behavior. It was in the way he looked at me. His gaze lingered just a little too long, like he was seeing something no one else did. And the way he smiled, it made my skin tingle in a way I couldn't explain. There was nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong," but deep down, something didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things. He's just being friendly, I thought. But every time we were alone, I could feel the tension growing. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just in my head. And then one day, everything changed. It was late in the evening. Mom had gone to visit a friend, and it was just me and Nate in the house. I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the weird feeling in my chest. That's when I noticed him standing in the doorway, watching me. His eyes weren't just looking, they were studying me, almost like he was trying to read my mind. "You look different today," he said, his voice calm, almost too casual. I froze. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it made my heart race. Different? What was that supposed to mean? I laughed it off, pretending like his words didn't bother me, but inside, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Something was off. The days that followed were even stranger. He always found a way to be near me, too near. A casual brush of his hand against mine, a lingering glance when no one else was around. It was subtle, but undeniable. And every time it happened, my mind screamed at me to say something, to call it out. But I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't want to ruin things for my mom. She was finally happy, and the last thing I wanted was to take that away from her. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. It only made things worse. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't realize it yet, but my life was about to change forever. What happened next? Let's just say things got way more complicated and dangerous. It was one of those mornings that starts off feeling so ordinary, you almost believe nothing unexpected could ever happen. Mom and I were packing up to leave for a few days to visit her sister. Nate, as usual, stayed behind, work, he said. That was the thing about Nate, he was always busy, always responsible. Mom adored that about him, trusted him completely. She thought he was everything she had been missing for so many years. I didn't think much of it when I headed downstairs, just craving a cup of coffee to help me wake up. I was still in my sleepwear, shorts and a loose t-shirt. I didn't expect anyone to be up yet, but when I walked into the kitchen, there he was. Nate. He stood by the counter, casually leaning against it with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking like he had all the time in the world. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth and calm, like always. "Morning," I replied quickly, trying to keep my tone neutral. But something about the way he looked at me made my skin prickle. His eyes lingered just a moment too long, scanning me from head to toe in a way that wasn't obvious but was definitely noticeable. I busied myself with pouring coffee, trying to ignore the way my heart suddenly started beating a little faster. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. But then he spoke again. "You look different today," he said, his voice calm but carrying something I couldn't quite place. "More grown up, maybe." I froze for a split second, gripping the coffee pot a little tighter than necessary. What was that supposed to mean? I forced a nervous laugh, shrugging as casually as I could manage. Thanks, I guess. He didn't say anything else, just took a sip of his coffee, but I could still feel his eyes on me as I finished pouring mine. The air felt heavier, like something unspoken was hanging between us. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to. Without another word, I grabbed my cup and left the kitchen, my mind racing. Upstairs, I tried to brush it off. He's just being friendly, I told myself. It doesn't mean anything. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, off, about the way he looked at me. It wasn't the first time I'd caught him watching me like that, but today felt stronger. More deliberate. I kept thinking about his words as I packed my bag. You look different today. More grown up. Why did that bother me so much? Why couldn't I just forget about it? The rest of the morning went by in a blur. Mom was bustling around, double-checking everything to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything. I tried to act normal, to pretend I wasn't thinking about Nate, but every time I stopped moving, his voice replayed in my mind. I hated how much space he was taking up in my head. When we were finally ready to leave, Mom called Nate to help with the last of the bags. I didn't want to see him again, but there he was, appearing in the doorway like it was nothing. He smiled at Mom as he took the suitcase from her hands, but when his eyes met mine, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't obvious, just a split-second look that sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly looked away, pretending to check my phone. Drive safe, he said, directing the words at both of us, but his gaze lingered on me just a little too long. I'll hold down the fort. Thanks, Mom replied cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the air. I forced a smile, nodding quickly before climbing into the car. As we backed out of the driveway, I couldn't help but glance back. Nate was still standing there, watching us leave, his hands shoved casually into his pockets. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there, watching. I quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead, but that knot in my stomach didn't go away. I knew I shouldn't be thinking about him. He was my mom's husband. He wasn't supposed to look at me that way, wasn't supposed to say things that made my heart race for all the wrong reasons. But the more I tried to push it away, the more those thoughts crept in. What if I wasn't imagining it? What if there really was something in the way he looked at me? Something dangerous. The car ride was quiet, with Mom chatting on and off while I nodded absent-mindedly, pretending to listen. But inside, my mind was spinning. I kept replaying every moment from the past few weeks, the lingering glances, the casual touches, the way he always seemed to find a reason to be near me when Mom wasn't around. It had always felt subtle, easy to dismiss as my imagination. But today, something had changed. It wasn't subtle anymore. And the worst part? A small, shameful part of me didn't hate the attention. That was what scared me the most. By the time we reached our destination, I had convinced myself that it was all in my head. Nate hadn't actually done anything wrong, right? He was just friendly. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was making something out of nothing. But deep down, I knew better. That moment in the kitchen wasn't just a coincidence. It was the first step, his first step. I didn't know what game he was playing, but I had a sinking feeling that things were only going to get more complicated from here. Coming back home after a couple of days away felt strange. Everything looked the same, yet something felt different. The moment I stepped through the front door, I noticed it. Nate was different. More confident, more present. He wasn't doing anything overtly unusual, but somehow he always managed to be around, close enough that I couldn't ignore his presence. He didn't need to say much. It was in the way he moved, the way his eyes seemed to follow me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. At first, I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But as the days went by, it became harder to ignore. He always found subtle ways to be near me, a brief touch on my arm as he passed by, a hand on my shoulder when he asked a simple question. Each time it happened, my heart raced, and I hated myself for the way my body reacted. It was like an invisible tension was growing between us, pulling tighter and tighter with every passing day. One evening, everything changed. Mom had to stay late at work, and it was just Nate and me at home. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I tried to keep myself busy, moving between my room and the kitchen, but every time I turned around, there he was, watching me with that calm, unreadable expression. "You want to watch a movie or something?" he asked casually as I passed by the living room. I hesitated. My first instinct was to say no, to find an excuse to stay in my room until Mom got home. But something about the way he asked, the ease in his voice, made it hard to refuse. Maybe I thought it would help break the weird tension. Maybe I just didn't want to seem scared. So I nodded, forcing a small smile. Sure, why not? I sat down on the couch, keeping a safe distance between us. He selected a movie, some action film I barely paid attention to, and for a while, everything felt almost normal. But then he shifted closer, just slightly, enough that our shoulders almost touched. I tried to focus on the screen, ignoring the way my pulse quickened. Then he handed me a cup of tea, his fingers brushing against mine as I took it. The touch lasted a moment too long, and my breath caught in my throat. "Are you comfortable?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. I froze for a second, unsure how to respond. My mind screamed at me to get up, to leave the room, but I didn't move. Instead, I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, even though something inside me twisted uncomfortably. "Yeah," I murmured. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, like he was waiting for something, testing the waters. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to break the moment without making things even weirder. So I stayed, pretending to watch the movie, pretending everything was okay. As the movie went on, I became hyper-aware of every little thing, every time he shifted, every time his arm brushed against mine. It felt like a game, one I didn't understand the rules of. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop playing. There was something intoxicating about the way he made me feel nervous, excited, alive in a way I hadn't felt before. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but I couldn't help myself. By the time the movie ended, I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't name. I stood up quickly, muttering something about being tired, and escaped to my room before he could say anything else. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell are you doing?" I whispered to myself. I knew I should tell Mom. I knew I should set some kind of boundary, make it clear that whatever this was couldn't continue. But every time I thought about it, I felt paralyzed. What if she didn't believe me? What if I was overreacting? What if it was all in my head? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Nate wasn't just being friendly, there was something more to the way he looked at me, the way he touched me. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that tension between us wasn't going away. The following days were complicated. Nate didn't push, didn't do anything obvious. But he didn't have to. The way he was around me, always calm, always so sure of himself, was enough to keep me on edge. He acted like nothing had changed, like everything was perfectly normal. But every time he was near, I could feel that same pull, that same dangerous energy hanging in the air. And the worst part? A small part of me didn't want it to stop. Over time, our conversations became more personal. What started as casual small talk gradually turned into something deeper. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't done with anyone else. I shared my fears, my doubts, and my dreams. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel truly seen. His calm voice and thoughtful responses created a sense of comfort I didn't know I was craving. There was something about the way he listened. He didn't rush to offer solutions or brush off my concerns. Instead, he made me feel like my thoughts mattered, like I wasn't alone in feeling lost sometimes. And slowly, before I realized what was happening, I began to look forward to these moments. I started waiting for his glances, for the brief touches on my arm or shoulder. At first, I told myself it was nothing. It was just nice to have someone who cared, someone who paid attention. But deep down, I knew it wasn't as innocent as I wanted to believe. There was something forbidden about it, something that sent a thrill through me every time we were alone. I knew it was wrong. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that I could stop these feelings if I wanted to. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. With each passing day, the tension between us grew. He found more reasons to be near me, more excuses to linger when we were alone. And every time our eyes met, I felt that pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer no matter how hard I tried to resist. One evening, when Mom was working late, things changed in a way I had been trying to prevent for weeks. It started off innocently enough. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when he walked in and casually asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I hesitated, knowing that being alone with him always left me feeling conflicted. But I didn't want to seem scared or awkward, so I agreed. We sat on opposite ends of the couch at first, the space between us acting like a fragile barrier. The movie played on the screen, but I wasn't paying attention. All I could think about was how aware I was of his presence. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. At some point, he shifted closer. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make my heart race. He handed me a glass of water, and when our fingers brushed, I felt a jolt, like an electric current passing between us. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, his voice low and calm, almost hypnotic. I nodded, though my chest tightened with something I couldn't quite describe: nervousness, excitement, fear. Maybe all of them at once. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied quietly, hoping my voice didn't betray the whirlwind of emotions inside me. But I wasn't fine. I could feel the tension wrapping around us like an invisible cord, pulling tighter with every second. I knew I should say something, break the moment before it went too far. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, caught between what I knew was right and what I couldn't stop feeling. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the movie playing in the background like white noise. I could feel him watching me, waiting for something. And in that moment, I realized something that terrified me. I wanted him to. I wanted him to look at me that way, to see me as something more than just his wife's daughter. It was a dangerous thought, one that I should have pushed away. But instead, I held on to it, letting it grow. By the time the movie ended, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between reason and desire. I got up quickly, muttering an excuse about being tired, and fled to my room before he could say anything. Once inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. "What am I doing?" I whispered to myself. I knew this was wrong. I knew I was playing with fire, and if I didn't stop, someone was going to get burned. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. Every time I thought about ending whatever this was, the thought of losing that connection felt unbearable. I told myself it was love. That's what it felt like, didn't it? The way he listened, the way he made me feel seen and understood, it had to be real. No one else had ever made me feel that way. But even as I tried to convince myself, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something I didn't want to hear. What if it wasn't love? What if it was just an illusion, something that felt real only because I wanted it to? What if he didn't see me the way I saw him? I didn't have answers to those questions. All I knew was that I was trapped in emotions I didn't fully understand, trapped between right and wrong, trapped between who I was and who I was becoming. And deep down, I knew that things were only going to get more complicated from here. Everything changed that day. I didn't plan to overhear anything. It just happened, one of those moments when fate seems to drag you into something you're not ready for. I was walking past the living room when I heard Nate's voice, relaxed and casual, like he didn't have a care in the world. She thinks it's serious, he said, his tone dripping with amusement. But come on, man, it's just a bit of fun. I stopped in my tracks. My heart froze mid-beat. He kept talking, and with every word, the walls around me seemed to close in tighter. She's so easy to manipulate. Just listens, smiles, trusts everything I say. Honestly, it's hilarious how naive she is. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. He was laughing at me. At the feelings I thought were real. At the connection I thought we had. And that's when I realized the bitter truth. I wasn't special to him. I was just a game. My mind raced. I wanted to burst into the room, scream at him, demand answers, demand to know how he could do this to me. But instead, I stood there, frozen, listening to him mock everything I had believed in. All the moments I thought meant something, me opening up to him, trusting him with my fears, were nothing more than entertainment for him. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was feel the crushing weight of humiliation and betrayal. And in that moment, something inside me changed. The part of me that wanted to hold on to him, that wanted to believe this was love, shattered into a million pieces. When I finally moved, it was like I was on autopilot. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall. My thoughts were a whirlwind, emotions clashing inside me, anger, sadness, disgust, but most of all, disappointment in myself. How could I have let this happen? How could I have been so blind? But the more I thought about it, the clearer things became. This wasn't my fault. He had manipulated me, taken advantage of my vulnerability, and twisted my emotions for his own selfish reasons. And I wasn't going to let him win. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him control my life anymore. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I had to take back the power he had stolen. The next morning, I sat down with my mom. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. But I knew what I had to do. "Mom, I need to tell you something," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, concerned. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. Every single detail. The way he looked at me, the way he listened, how he made me feel special, and how he had been playing me the entire time. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but as the words spilled out, I felt lighter, like I was finally freeing myself from a weight I had carried for too long. When I finished, there was silence. Mom didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what I had just told her. "I had no idea," she finally whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "He fooled both of us." She nodded slowly, and in that moment, I saw something shift in her expression, hurt, yes, but also determination. She wasn't going to let this slide. And neither was I. By the end of the day, Nate was gone. Mom kicked him out without a second thought. There were no long arguments, no second chances. He tried to explain, tried to twist things in his favor, but we didn't listen. We were done with him. Looking back, that day marked the end of one chapter in my life and the beginning of another. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. But I learned something important through it all. I learned that not everyone who seems to care truly does. I learned that trust is something you don't give away lightly. And most importantly, I learned that I am stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. Do I regret it? Maybe. Maybe I regret trusting him. Maybe I regret letting things go as far as they did. But what I don't regret is standing up for myself. I don't regret walking away from someone who didn't deserve my love. So, what would you have done in my place? Would you have told your mom? Would you have walked away, or stayed silent, hoping things would somehow get better? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments.